Forget everything you think you know about medieval executions. It wasn't always a burly man in a hood swinging the axe. Sometimes the hood came off, and the executioner was a woman. Imagine the shame for a condemned man, not only facing death, but meeting it at the hands of someone he was raised to believe was weaker, lesser beneath him. In the Middle Ages, nothing stripped a man of his pride more brutally than dying under a woman's blade. The square is full. Farmers with mud still on their boots, children squirming in their mothers' arms, the drunks already shouting insults. Everyone's here for the same reason, to watch justice swing its blade. But today the murmurs ripple differently through the crowd, because the figure stepping forward isn't the hulking man they expected. It's a woman. Hood pulled low, axe gleaming. This wasn't theatre, it happened. Female executioners were rare, but they existed. Women who burned, whipped and beheaded men in front of jeering crowds. In parts of Germany, Switzerland and Central Europe, execution was a family business. If a man who held the office died, his widow or daughter was expected to carry it on. Someone had to keep the blood flowing, and in a society that believed a woman's place was in the kitchen, there was no bigger shock than seeing her on the scaffold instead. Executioners were never respected. They lived outside city walls, married within their own families, carried the stink of death even when they walked through the market. But a woman in that role, that was different. People gossiped about them like witches. Too much blood on their hands, too much power in a place no woman was supposed to stand, and the condemned men knew it. Imagine the humiliation. Kneeling in the dirt, bound and helpless, while a woman sharpened the blade that would end you. In a culture built on the idea of male dominance, this was the ultimate reversal. The crowd knew it too. They laughed harder when the executioner was a woman. The spectacle wasn't just about death. It was about stripping the condemned of his last scrap of dignity. Sometimes the women leaned into that. Records describe female executioners who mocked their victims, jeering at men who had once strutted proudly through the town square. They weren't only killers, they were performers. In a world where public executions doubled as entertainment, every sneer and every insult twisted the knife, deeper than the blade itself. And these weren't just petty thieves, men condemned for rape, adultery, sodomy, even heresy, found themselves beneath a woman's hand. The irony wasn't lost on the crowd. Crimes born of power and lust punished by the very gender men were supposed to dominate. It wasn't just punishment. It was humiliation elevated to ritual. Close your eyes for a moment. Hear the drum roll. The condemned man kneels, sweat dripping down his face. He refuses to look at her, as though ignoring her will make her less real. The crowd holds its breath. Then the axe flashes down, swift and sure. The head rolls, the blood sprays, and the jeers erupt. Justice has been done. But the shame of it, a man destroyed by a woman, will live longer than the body cooling on the straw. Most people never imagined women stepping onto the scaffold. But when it happened, it burned itself into local memory. These weren't imagined tales. A handful of chronicles and court documents record them. And every time a woman lifted the axe, society shuddered. In Germany and Switzerland, executioner families were bound to their work like a curse. If a man died suddenly, the law still needed its killer. So the wife or daughter was pushed forward. In Nuremberg, one chronicle tells of a widow who, with no son old enough to inherit the trade, took up her husband's sword and carried out beheadings until her boy came of age. The townsfolk called her the widow with the blade. Men sneered, but none dared cross her. These women weren't amateurs. Many had grown up in executioner households, watching their fathers or brothers swing axes, tie nooses, light pyres. They learned by proximity, just as butchers' children learn to slaughter animals. So when the time came, they knew how to steady a hand, how to position the body, how to silence a squirming prisoner. And men hated it. For a condemned man, being killed by any executioner was degrading. But dying at the hands of a woman stripped away the last shred of masculine pride. One French ballad mocked a thief executed by a female beheader, sneering that he had been undone by skirt and steel. The shame outlived the death. Some women became infamous. In Basel, a female executioner was remembered for her brutal efficiency. She executed thieves, arsonists, and even soldiers who had deserted. Crowds whispered that she enjoyed the work, that she smiled when she raised her axe. Maybe it was superstition. Maybe it was projection. Men couldn't imagine a woman wielding power without cruelty. Either way, her legend grew, and criminals dreaded her name more than that of any male colleague. But their work wasn't limited to clean beheadings. They also flogged prisoners, branded foreheads with hot irons, and cut off ears or fingers as punishment. Sometimes it was women punishing men for crimes of lust, rape, adultery, assault. Picture the scene. A man dragged into the square, shirt torn away, while a woman lashes his back raw with a whip. The crowd roars, half in horror, half in glee. In that moment, the balance of gendered power turns upside down. It didn't matter if she hated the job, or did it out of duty. To the condemned, the humiliation was total. A woman, in a world where women were treated as fragile, obedient, lesser, was the one inflicting pain, commanding the crowd's gaze, and deciding the pace of suffering. Whispers spread that such women were unnatural, unfeminine, dangerous. Some were accused of witchcraft, their skill with the axe framed as devil's work. Others became twisted into folklore, not remembered as real people, but as symbols of shame. To be killed by a female executioner was said to curse a man even in the afterlife. And yet, in a strange way, society needed them. Death had to be dealt, justice had to be seen. When no man was available, the scaffold did not stand empty. The women stepped in, and every time they did, they left the crowd uneasy, because it exposed something medieval men feared deeply, that strength, control, and authority weren't exclusive to them. Execution in the Middle Ages was never just about ending a life. It was theatre, ritual, and most importantly, humiliation. And when the executioner was a woman, that humiliation was sharpened into something unforgettable. Men expected to dominate women. They were taught from birth that women were weaker, gentler, meant to obey. To find themselves bound, stripped and punished by a woman was a wound to pride deeper than any blade. The authorities knew this, and they sometimes leaned into it. A female executioner became the ultimate weapon of shame. Take public whippings. For petty theft, fraud or disorderly conduct, a man might be tied to a post in the square and whipped until blood ran down his back. When a woman wielded the whip, the crowd roared louder. They laughed not just at his pain, but at the sight of his body bending under her hand. Some records describe women taunting men as they lashed them, spitting insults, making the crowd laugh at their expense. For the condemned, it wasn't only punishment, it was mockery in its most cutting form. Then there were punishments of exposure. Men convicted of adultery or sexual crimes could be forced to stand naked or half-dressed while beaten or branded. If the one holding the iron was a woman, the shame was doubled. Medieval culture tied masculinity to control over women's bodies. Losing control of one's own body in front of a woman while she pressed a red-hot iron to your flesh was degradation beyond measure. In some towns, women executioners were deliberately chosen to punish crimes against women. A rapist lashed by a female hand, an abusive husband branded by a woman's iron. The symbolism was unmistakable, and the crowd felt it. The man's crime was thrown back in his face, punishment delivered not just by the law, but by the very gender he had wronged. It didn't always stop with punishment. In folklore, women executioners became figures of ridicule and terror. Men whispered that they humiliated victims before the axe fell, forcing them to beg, mocking their manhood, drawing out the spectacle so the crowd could savour every ounce of shame. Whether these tales were true or not hardly mattered. What mattered was that the idea of a man destroyed by a woman, not only in life but in death, terrified medieval society. Step into the square again. A man kneels, stripped to the waist, the jeers of the crowd ringing in his ears. A woman steps forward, whip in hand, her face impassive. The lash cuts across his back, and he flinches. The crowd howls with laughter, not because of the pain, but because the roles have been reversed. For one moment, she holds all the power, and he has none. In a society obsessed with order, this reversal was chaos. And chaos was both thrilling and frightening. People couldn't stop watching. That's why stories of female executioners survived, even if only in whispers. Because they embodied something medieval, men feared more than death itself: shame at the hands of a woman. If there was one place where the presence of a female executioner struck the deepest chord, it was in the punishment of sexual crimes. Medieval law took a twisted interest in controlling bodies, especially when lust or violence crossed the boundaries of social order. Men who committed rape, adultery, or sodomy often faced brutal punishment, and when the executioner was a woman, the message was unmistakable: the shame of your crime will be answered by the shame of your death. Imagine a man convicted of rape. In many towns, he might first be paraded through the streets, chained and mocked, sometimes with crude symbols of his crime hung around his neck. But if a female executioner delivered the blows, the whip on his back, the iron branding his flesh, the humiliation cut far deeper. He wasn't only punished by the law, he was punished by the very gender he had tried to dominate. The spectacle became poetic justice. For adulterers, the punishments varied. In parts of Germany and France, adulterous men were beaten, fined, or publicly humiliated. Women executioners sometimes carried out these penalties. Picture it: a man bound to a cart, dragged through the town, while a woman lashes him, the crowd jeering at every stroke. The insult was obvious: the man of the house reduced to a spectacle, his body disciplined by the hands of a woman. Even harsher were the punishments for sodomy. Men accused of same-sex relations were burned alive, drowned, or mutilated. Here, the presence of a female executioner added layers of symbolic cruelty. The medieval imagination linked sodomy with the loss of masculinity, and to be punished by a woman only drove home that loss. It was a final reminder that in the eyes of society, these men had failed to uphold their supposed role as masters. But there were subtler humiliations too. Some execution records describe men forced to strip, kneel, and submit before the woman's hand. Others mention that women mocked the condemned verbally, spitting insults about their crimes, while the crowd roared with laughter. These weren't just killings, they were performances of gender, designed to strip away every last shred of power. And the audience loved it. For the people in the square, this wasn't only about justice, it was entertainment, raw, grotesque, unforgettable. They didn't just want to see a criminal die, they wanted to see him broken, mocked, humiliated. A female executioner ensured exactly that. Step closer. Picture a man convicted of abusing his wife. He's dragged onto the scaffold, face swollen from the mob's blows, and waiting there is a woman with the whip. She raises it, and the crowd erupts. Each strike is more than punishment. It's vengeance. It's the community's way of saying, you thought you owned women, now a woman owns your pain. This inversion of power terrified medieval men. To be killed was one thing. To be killed by a woman was another. But to be punished by a woman specifically for crimes of lust or violence, that was unbearable. It wasn't just the end of life. It was the end of pride, the erasure of status, the burning away of everything that made a man in medieval eyes. And this is why stories of female executioners lingered in whispers long after they disappeared from records. They weren't remembered just as killers. They were remembered as symbols of humiliation, walking reminders that even in the harshest patriarchy, there were moments, brief, terrifying, unforgettable, when women held the whip, the axe, and the power. Execution wasn't always swift. In fact, the scaffold was often just the final act. Before a man ever reached the axe or the rope, he might first pass through the torture chambers. And in rare unnerving cases, the hands inflicting that pain belonged to a woman. Torture in the Middle Ages was legal, ritualized, and deeply theatrical. Authorities used it not just to extract confessions, but to humiliate, to terrify, and to demonstrate the absolute power of the law. The presence of a female executioner in this setting changed everything. What was already degrading became unbearable for men who prided themselves on dominance. Picture the chamber, stone walls slick with damp, the air thick with smoke from torches. A man is bound to a chair, ropes cutting into his wrists. He expects a hulking man with a black hood to enter. Instead, the door creaks open, and a woman steps forward, apron tied tight, hands already holding iron tongs, or a whip. The shame hits before the pain does. He flinches not from the tools, but from the sight of her, because he knows that when he screams, he'll scream in front of her. Women executioners sometimes oversaw lashings, 30, 40, 50 strokes across a man's back, until his flesh tore open. Others applied branding irons, pressing the red-hot metal to skin while reciting the prisoner's crimes aloud. In a society that valued masculine stoicism, every groan, every cry, every tear became entertainment for the guards and humiliation for the prisoner. There were darker methods too. The strappado, suspending a prisoner by his bound wrists until his shoulders dislocated. The rack, stretching the body until joints cracked. If a woman administered these, the shame doubled. The prisoner, often accused of violence, theft, or rebellion, found himself begging for mercy, not from a fellow man, but from someone society told him was weak. And the guards laughed hardest when his voice broke. Folklore twisted these images even further. Stories spread of female torturers who enjoyed the work, who mocked men's bodies as they inflicted pain, who lingered over their suffering. Whether true or not, the rumour itself was enough to stain their names forever. To the medieval imagination, a woman with power was already unnatural. A woman with the whip and the iron was monstrous. And yet their work had purpose. Torture wasn't simply cruelty. It was ritualised theatre for the record. Each scream, each broken bone, was written down as proof that the confession was freely given. The irony was bitter. Men destroyed by women in chambers designed to extract truth. Their pain became ink on parchment, a permanent reminder of their shame. Now step into that chamber yourself. Hear the squeal of the iron turning red in the brazier. Smell the acrid smoke. See the prisoner's eyes widen when the door opens. And the one stepping through is a woman. She doesn't hesitate. She lifts the iron, presses it to his chest. The hiss fills the room. The scream follows, and the humiliation is complete. Execution might have ended the man's life, but it was in the torture chambers, sometimes under the hands of a woman, that his pride, his identity, was broken long before his body. Executions in the Middle Ages were never private affairs. They were designed for the public eye, part punishment, part theatre, part festival. The crowd wasn't just a witness, it was an active participant, jeering, laughing, throwing insults, and sometimes even food. But when the executioner was a woman, the atmosphere shifted. People expected brutality from men. A scarred, hooded figure swinging an axe was familiar, almost routine. But the sight of a woman stepping onto the scaffold with the tools of death provoked something else. Nervous laughter, gossip, even unease. The crowd whispered that the world had turned upside down. For some, it was hilarious. Men shouted crude jokes about the condemned losing to a woman. Children pointed and laughed. Not at the death itself, they'd seen plenty of that, but at the humiliation of a man kneeling before her. The mockery carried beyond the execution square. Songs and ballads circulated about men, undone by skirts and steel, reducing their final moments to tavern entertainment. Death wasn't just death, it became a comedy act at their expense. For others, the spectacle was unsettling. Medieval culture revolved around rigid hierarchies, men above women, clergy above laity, nobles above peasants. A female executioner disrupted all of that. Watching her command the stage, wielding authority in front of hundreds, was a reminder that power wasn't as fixed as people like to believe, and that thought was dangerous. Crowds often fed on humiliation. The condemned wasn't only supposed to die, he was supposed to be broken, stripped of pride, reduced to nothing. A woman made that spectacle sharper. Her presence alone humiliated him before she even raised a hand. By the time the axe fell, his dignity had already been executed in front of everyone he had ever known. But the crowd's reactions weren't always laughter or shock. Sometimes it was fear. Whispers spread that women executioners had unnatural strength, that they enjoyed the work too much, that their power came from dark forces. To watch one calmly wipe blood from her axe was enough to chill even hardened spectators. Some swore their eyes gleamed unnaturally. Others claimed their victims screamed louder than usual, as if the shame of it made the pain worse. And here's the twist: the authorities knew exactly what they were doing. They understood that a female executioner magnified the punishment. It wasn't only about killing a body, it was about killing a reputation, a sense of manhood, the very memory of the condemned. A man might have stolen, raped or rebelled, but in the end, the punishment everyone remembered wasn't just his crime. It was that a woman had been the one to finish him. Now close your eyes and place yourself in that crowd. The drums beat, the condemned kneels, and the woman steps forward. Half the audience laughs, half falls silent. You feel both thrill and dread, because you're watching the impossible, the world's order tipped upside down for a single bloody moment. That's why these stories survived, even in whispers. Because to the crowd, the image of a woman on the scaffold wasn't just shocking, it was unforgettable. If official records spoke sparingly of women executioners, folklore filled the silence with whispers, exaggerations, and monsters. What few women stepped onto the scaffold in real life became larger-than-life figures in the imagination of towns and villages across Europe. People feared them, mocked them, and turned them into cautionary tales to scare children at night. The folk memory twisted these women into something inhuman. They weren't seen as dutiful widows or daughters forced to carry out executions. They were witches with blades, demons in skirts, harbingers of shame. In tales retold by firelight, they didn't just swing the axe, they laughed while doing it, savouring the sight of men trembling before them. Their voices were said to echo unnaturally, their hands steady where no normal woman's could be. In Germanic folklore, one story told of the blood widow, a woman who inherited her husband's role as executioner and was said to relish her power. People claimed she whispered to her victims before killing them, mocking their sins and promising to haunt their families. Another tale from Eastern Europe spoke of a woman who cursed men as she whipped them, claiming their souls would belong to her in the afterlife. Whether or not such women ever existed didn't matter. The stories worked because they tapped into deep male anxieties about humiliation and female power. The association with witchcraft was almost inevitable. Any woman who stepped outside prescribed roles, wife, mother, servant, risked being branded as unnatural. But when a woman publicly ended men's lives, the leap to calling her a witch was short. Crowds whispered that her strength came not from training, but from the devil, that her calmness during executions was proof of demonic possession. This made the shame of being executed by her worse still. A man wasn't just losing to a woman, he was, in their eyes, losing to the devil. Children's rhymes even hinted at the fear. One verse collected centuries later warned boys not to steal bread, lest the widow with the axe take your head. In this way, the image of the female executioner became a bogey woman, part of the moral machinery of medieval society, a living symbol of punishment that lingered long after her work ended. Folklore also sexualized these women in grotesque ways. In bawdy tavern songs, men joked that being killed by a female executioner was the last embrace of a woman, a cruel jest that turned the horror of death into mockery. Others claimed that some women taunted their victims about their manhood, a humiliation worse than the blade itself. Whether fact or invention, these stories always returned to the same theme, the unbearable shame of male dominance overturned. But there's another layer here. Folklore preserved what official records sought to erase. Municipal ledgers might only note that justice was done with no mention of the executioner's gender, but oral stories refused to forget. They remembered the faces, the moments of shock, the uneasy thrill of watching a woman wield the axe. They exaggerated, embroidered, and twisted the details, but in doing so they ensured the memory survived. So the next time villagers huddled by the fire, telling ghost stories of headless men and cursed widows, they weren't just entertaining themselves. They were processing the discomfort of a world where for a brief moment the natural order had flipped and women had held power not with words but with steel. Step back into that crowd one more time. The woman raises her axe, the man kneels, and whispers ripple through the people around you. Someone mutters, "Witch." Another laughs too loudly. A child clutches her mother's hand tighter, and you realise it isn't just the condemned who's afraid. It's everyone. For all the spectacle of the scaffold, the truth is that the lives of female executioners outside of those bloody moments were just as grim, if not worse. The roll didn't end when the axe was set down, or the whip was coiled. It followed them home, clinging like smoke and blood, marking them in ways society never let them forget. Executioners of any gender lived on the edges of towns, physically and socially. Their houses were often built outside the city walls, near cemeteries, gallows, or rivers where bodies were dumped. The placement was deliberate. No one wanted them as neighbours. The smell of death was said to follow them. The taint of their work seeped into their families. For a woman, the isolation was doubled. She wasn't only feared as an executioner, she was distrusted as a woman who had stepped into a man's role. Marriages for women executioners were difficult. Few men wanted to marry them unless they were from executioner families themselves. This often led to inbreeding within the small circles of executioner dynasties that passed the job down from father to son and occasionally to daughter. Records suggest that women sometimes married other marginalised men, grave diggers, knackers, or butchers, people who also dealt with blood and death, and were therefore already outcasts. It was survival, not romance. Everyday life was filled with contradictions. On one hand, they were feared, spat at, and avoided in markets. People refused to touch their wares if they sold food or cloth, convinced it carried a curse. On the other hand, townsfolk still depended on them for grisly tasks no one else would do. Executioners, male and female, doubled as cleaners of waste, killers of stray animals, even medical experts for desperate patients who thought their knowledge of bodies might heal as well as kill. A woman executioner might be called to cut away rot from a wound, only to be mocked the next day as a witch. Children of these women inherited the stigma. They were bullied, called crows, hangman's brats, or worse. Daughters were often pushed into marriage within their own cursed circle, and sons were expected to continue the bloody line. But for daughters who themselves took up the axe, the weight of shame was heavier. Society made it clear, no matter what else they did, they would always be defined by that moment on the scaffold, that role no one wanted but everyone demanded. Religious life offered no refuge. Churches sometimes barred executioner families from receiving sacraments with the rest of the congregation. Women executioners were whispered about in sermons as examples of moral disorder, a sign of how far the world had slipped. Yet at the same time, priests and bishops still signed the orders that forced them to carry out punishments. Hypocrisy hung over everything, like incense turned sour, and then there were the personal tolls. Imagine a woman who had to return home after a day of killing, washing blood from her hands in a bucket of cold water, the sound of her children playing outside while she tried to scrub away the evidence of what she'd just done. Every meal, every moment of sleep was shadowed by the knowledge that she'd taken lives not because she wanted to, but because society demanded it. Her power was visible on the scaffold, but in private she bore only the loneliness of it. Folklore and records alike suggest that some women executioners embraced the role, wielding it with pride. Others carried it like a burden, breaking under its weight. Some tried to fade into anonymity after their duties, but the stigma never loosened its grip. People pointed, children laughed, husbands turned cold. So while the crowd may have laughed at the sight of a man dying at a woman's hands, the woman herself rarely laughed at all. Her life beyond the scaffold was a punishment of its own. Exile in plain sight. A life lived among people who both needed and despised her, forever trapped in the role of death's handmaiden. While most names of female executioners were scrubbed from official history, a few slipped through the cracks, preserved in court records, town chronicles, or sensationalized pamphlets that delighted in scandal. These fragments remind us that women did sometimes step into the role of state-sanctioned killers, and their cases shocked communities into remembering them for centuries. One of the earliest references comes from Augsburg, Germany, in the 16th century. When the town's executioner died suddenly, his widow was ordered to finish the scheduled punishments until a replacement could be hired. She reportedly carried out several floggings and one decapitation. The record notes the crowd's laughter, not because the death was amusing, but because the condemned man begged pitifully for mercy once he realised who stood over him. The clerk scribbled almost gleefully that the man wept like a child when faced with the widow's hand. That humiliation was the real punishment. In Prague, there's a mention of a hangman's daughter who inherited the work when no male heir was available. Locals refused to look her in the eye, calling her cursed. But when she was tasked with branding thieves in the town square, people pushed to the front to watch. Not because the crime was unusual, branding was routine, but because a woman was the one wielding the iron. Chroniclers wrote that the shame was double, the fire, and that it came from her. Perhaps the most notorious case comes from France. A woman known only as Jeanne Laruelle appeared in records during the 17th century. She reportedly conducted executions for nearly a decade after her husband's death. Whispers surrounded her, with claims she mocked men before their deaths, commenting on their crimes or even their bodies. Pamphlets painted her as a grotesque caricature, a woman drunk on both wine and blood. Whether these stories were true or exaggerated, her reputation became legend. In taverns, men cursed her name as shorthand for emasculation. Better the rope than Jeanne's hand, they said. Smaller towns produced stranger cases still. In some places, women carried out symbolic acts of punishment. For example, in Switzerland, records tell of a baker caught cheating customers with false weights. Instead of a man, a female executioner beat him in public, declaring each stroke in front of the crowd. Witnesses remembered less the crime than the humiliation. To be whipped by a woman was worse than the hunger he caused. What ties these cases together isn't the rarity of women taking up the axe or the whip. It's the reaction of society. Each time it happened, it left a scar in memory, told and retold as scandal, legend or warning. Male executioners came and went. Their work was accepted, almost invisible, but a female executioner became unforgettable. Close your eyes and imagine being there. The condemned kneels, expecting the usual hooded man. Instead, skirts swish, a woman steps forward, and the crowd ripples with gasps and laughter. You see the condemned's shoulders slump, his pride crumbling faster than his body will. And long after the blade falls, it isn't the crime people remember. It's the shame of who carried out the justice. That's why these stories survived. Because in a world obsessed with order and hierarchy, a woman on the scaffold was chaos made flesh. The execution scaffold wasn't just a place of punishment. It was a stage where society acted out its deepest fears and values. Every stroke of the whip, every swing of the axe reinforced the hierarchy. The ruler above the ruled, the law above the criminal, men above women. That's why the presence of a female executioner was more than a curiosity. It was a crack in the foundation of medieval order. To understand the shock, you have to remember how tightly medieval Europe clung to gender roles. Men were the enforcers, the warriors, the wielders of public power. Women were supposed to embody submission, quiet, obedient, hidden behind veils and within homes. When a woman took the scaffold, dressed not in silks but in blood-stained aprons, she shattered that image. She became both feared and despised, not because she killed, but because she killed men. The symbolism went even deeper. For a condemned man, dying at the hands of another man was grim but honourable. You'd lost to a peer, someone within the same frame of masculinity. To die under a woman's hand, that stripped you of manhood itself. It wasn't just death, it was emasculation. The memory would live on in shameful whispers long after the body was buried, and society knew this. Officials sometimes deliberately put women in these roles when humiliation was part of the sentence. Imagine a man guilty of assaulting women being whipped by one, or a soldier, proud of his strength, flinching before a widow's steady arm. These weren't accidents, they were calculated degradations, aimed at breaking more than the body. Religious symbolism added another layer. The church preached that women were closer to sin, prone to temptation, weaker in faith. Seeing a woman as executioner blurred that narrative. Was she a servant of justice or of the devil? Some saw her as a necessary evil, a reminder that sin punished sin. Others muttered that her very presence invited divine wrath. Priests sometimes insisted that female executioners confess more often, as if wielding the axe made them spiritually unclean. And yet, in the shadows of this disgust was fascination. Men in taverns laughed nervously about the hangman's daughter. Songs mocked the idea of a woman stripping a man of his pride. But hidden beneath the mockery was an unspoken fear. If women could kill men in public, what else could they do? The scaffold became a symbol not just of justice, but of the instability of the social order itself. For women, the symbolism was a prison. Their power was undeniable on the scaffold. No one could laugh when the axe fell. But outside of it, they were stripped of respect. Their authority didn't lift them, it trapped them. They weren't seen as equal to men, but as monsters, aberrations, warnings. They carried a stigma as permanent as the blood that soaked their clothes. So when you picture that woman standing on the scaffold, axe in hand, you're not just seeing an execution. You're seeing a society wrestling with its own contradictions. A world that demanded female obedience, yet sometimes forced women into the ultimate position of dominance, ending our man's life. It terrified them because it revealed a truth no one wanted to admit, that power, once placed in a woman's hands, could never be unseen. Now imagine the silence before the blade drops. The man kneels, eyes wide, pride broken. The crowd shifts uneasily, laughter mixing with whispers. And there she stands, embodying everything the medieval world feared most, a woman holding absolute power over life and death. When we talk about medieval executions, it's tempting to think only of punishment. A life ended for a crime. But often the real goal wasn't simply death, it was humiliation, a deliberate breaking of body and pride in front of a crowd that came to watch like it was theatre. And when a woman was chosen to carry out the punishment, that humiliation cut twice as deep. Consider this, in many cases the execution itself wasn't even the harshest part. A nobleman condemned for treason might have expected to die by sword, swift, clean, honourable. But if the authorities wanted to make a statement, they might hand him over to a woman instead. Suddenly, his honourable death became a spectacle of shame. Imagine kneeling before someone society said was weaker, and hearing the crowd erupt in laughter before the blade even fell. The act itself became an insult etched into memory. Punishments weren't always fatal. Women executioners were sometimes ordered to flog men guilty of theft, adultery, or drunken disorder. A beating in public was bad enough, but being beaten by a woman? That was considered worse than the crime itself. Reports from Switzerland and the Low Countries describe thieves stripped to the waist and whipped in front of jeering neighbours. The men flinched, the crowd mocked, and the humiliation lingered longer than the bruises. In some cases, the records note that men fainted before the lash even struck, a psychological collapse under the weight of shame. The humiliation was intentional. Authorities went blind to the symbolic power of gender. In patriarchal societies obsessed with male honour, what better way to destroy a man's pride than to let a woman oversee his punishment? It was a social death, long before the physical one. The crowd which came for entertainment knew it. That's why laughter often filled the square. It wasn't laughter at justice. It was laughter at the collapse of dignity. And here's the darker truth. Women executioners themselves sometimes leaned into this role. Some jeered at their victims, echoing the taunts of the crowd. Others were said to whisper insults before delivering the blow, stripping away the last fragments of their victim's pride. Was this cruelty or a shield for women burdened with the stigma of their role? Mocking the condemned may have been a way to reclaim agency in a life where they were otherwise despised. Even in death, humiliation lingered. Chronicles tell of men whose heads were displayed on spikes, with crowds whispering not about their crimes, but about the shame of how they died. He fell to her hand, they'd say, turning the manner of execution into a legacy of ridicule. Families carried the burden too. Children grew up hearing their fathers mocked, not just as criminals, but as men undone by a woman's blade. Now, put yourself in that square. The condemned is dragged out, stripped, forced to kneel. You hear the laughter around you, sharper this time, tinged with cruelty. Then she steps forward. The condemned's shoulders slump, his pride collapsing under the weight of the spectacle. Before the first lash or stroke, he's already broken, and that, the public dismantling of manhood, was the true purpose of giving women the axe, the whip, or the rope. Execution in the Middle Ages wasn't only about justice, it was about performance. And when a woman played the role of executioner, the play turned into a farce, one designed to scar the condemned with shame deeper than death itself. Fear of death has always been universal, but when a condemned man realised he would be executed by a woman, the terror sharpened into something deeper, humiliation that began long before the blade touched skin. Chroniclers describe prisoners trembling at the very announcement. In a society obsessed with honour, a man's last act on earth was supposed to preserve some shred of dignity. To die bravely, to stare fate in the eye, this was how one salvaged a shred of manhood, even in disgrace. But when word spread that a woman would be the executioner, men often broke early. Some begged for a male hand to do the job, pleading with judges, priests, even the crowd. They weren't trying to escape death, they were trying to escape shame. The psychological collapse was visible. Witnesses recorded prisoners weeping, refusing food, or collapsing into silence when told of their female executioner. One clerk in Augsburg scribbled that a thief looked upon the widow with greater horror than upon the gallows itself. For him, the rope was not the worst fate, it was who tied it. Crowds knew this, they relished it, the spectacle of a man losing his composure before a woman amplified the entertainment. Mockery spilled from the onlookers before the punishment even began. Jeers about weakness, questions about manhood, cruel laughter, all of it stripped the condemned down before the real act took place. Execution became not just a physical sentence, but a psychological unravelling staged for everyone to see. The condemned's family bore the burden too. Sons and brothers carried the stain of dishonour, whispered about for years afterward. Daughters faced mockery in marriage markets. Her father fell to a woman's hand. This ripple effect ensured that Even the dead could not escape humiliation. It infected the living who carried their name. And then there was the torment of anticipation. A man could spend days, sometimes weeks in a cell, knowing the face he would meet on the scaffold wasn't the hooded hangman, but a woman. Every creak of the prison gate became a reminder that pride would be torn away before breath. Some likely prayed not for life, but for unconsciousness before the axe fell. Even in folklore, men executed by women were rarely remembered as criminals first. They were remembered as disgraced. Their crimes faded, but the shame remained immortalized. A soldier, a thief, a drunk. It didn't matter what they had done. What mattered was that in the end they had fallen to her. So when we ask how male criminals face female executioners, the answer is brutally simple. They broke. Pride gave way to fear. Dignity to begging. Their torment was as much mental as physical, and in the eyes of medieval society, that was the point. Now picture yourself standing in that square. The condemned kneels, tears streaking his cheeks. The woman steps forward, steady, silent. The crowd roars with laughter before the blade even rises. And in that moment, you understand. His death has already begun, carved into his pride. If the condemned man carried shame to his grave, the woman executioner carried something heavier, a burden that never left her, long after the scaffold was silent. For the men, death ended humiliation. For the women, life itself became a sentence. Female executioners were never allowed to forget who they were. Every trip to the market, every step in a church, every whisper behind their back carried the reminder. People saw not a woman, not a mother, not a neighbour, but the hand of death. Children were warned not to play near their houses. Merchants refused their coin, believing it tainted. Even water drawn from a well they touched might be avoided, as if shame and blood could leak into the bucket. The psychological toll was immense. Accounts describe executioner families sinking into depression, alcoholism, or violent tempers. For women, the strain was multiplied. They were seen as unnatural. A man who executed was despised but accepted. Someone had to do the dirty work. A woman who executed was considered monstrous, as if she had abandoned the very essence of her sex. Neighbours whispered that no man could sleep peacefully with such a wife. No child grow up without inheriting her curse. And yet, survival required them to keep going. Some leaned into the role with bitterness, hardening themselves with cruelty. They mocked their victims, not out of joy, but as armour against the hatred directed back at them. Others retreated into silence, living like ghosts at the edges of towns, avoiding eye contact, avoiding conversation, existing in the shadows. Religion offered little comfort. Priests often denied women executioners absolution unless they confessed to excesses in their work. A cruel irony, since the church itself demanded their labour. Some women were publicly shamed in sermons, their names spoken as examples of sin made flesh. Imagine kneeling in prayer only to hear the priest use you as a symbol of everything wrong with the world. At home, the burden poisoned family life. Children inherited stigma before they could even walk. Daughters of women executioners were often refused marriage into respectable families. Sons were mocked as weaklings, destined to inherit their mother's cursed profession. Some families turned inwards, marrying only within their own blood-stained circles. For women, the role wasn't just a job, it was a brand burned into their children's future. Perhaps the most tragic element was isolation. Executioners, male or female, lived outside city walls, but for women, that exile was doubled. Even other marginalised people, Butchers, knackers, grave diggers kept their distance. Loneliness became routine. A woman could wield power in front of hundreds on a scaffold, then return home to sit alone in silence, her only company, the echo of jeers and the memory of faces she had ended. And yet buried in these records are glimpses of resilience. Some women executioners carved out a kind of defiant pride. They accepted that they would never be loved or respected, so they claimed fear instead. A chronicler in Nuremberg notes one such woman who looked men in the eyes and made them lower theirs. Power became her mask, her shield. But whether that power gave her peace or merely hardened her despair, we will never know. So while male criminals died humiliated, it was the women who lived humiliated every day, every breath, long after the crowd had gone home. Their burden was not just blood on their hands, but the certainty that no matter what else they did, history would remember them only as monsters in skirts. When the official records fell silent, folklore picked up the story and turned female executioners into monsters. In the popular imagination, no woman could wield the axe without being something other than human. If the church branded them as sinners, the people around the fireside branded them as witches. Ballads and folk tales twisted these women into grotesque figures. In German lands, there were whispers of the Bluttier, the blood whore, a woman who laughed as she cut men down, her apron forever soaked red. Children were told that if they misbehaved, the hangman's wife would slip into their room at night and drag them away. Executioner women became bogeymen in skirts, weapons of fear to keep kids obedient. Chroniclers exaggerated their cruelty, transforming them into near-mythical villains. A woman might have performed a handful of floggings, but rumour claimed she castrated men for fun. One branding might morph into a tale of her carving symbols into skin like a witch's curse. Fear fed imagination, and imagination built monsters. The demonisation wasn't accidental. It was a way for society to deal with the discomfort these women provoked. A man could accept another man killing him. It was grim but logical. A woman killing a man. That defied the order of the universe. So instead of facing the reality, people wrapped it in stories. These women weren't really women. They were demons in disguise, cursed daughters of Cain, avatars of hell itself. In some towns, their memory seeped into rituals. During carnivals, men dressed in women's clothes would mockingly pretend to flog each other, reenacting the shame of being punished by a woman. Satire turned into tradition, keeping alive the association of women executioners with humiliation long after the real women were gone. Even their graves didn't escape. Female executioners, like their male counterparts, were buried outside consecrated ground. But rumours spread that their spirits lingered, restless, haunting crossroads and scaffold sites. In France, there were tales of a woman executioner whose ghost appeared at night, sharpening her blade, waiting for men who wandered too close. The dead carried on the stigma of the living. And yet in some dark corner of these tales there's a strange respect. Fear is a kind of power. These women, demonised and cursed, were still remembered. They haunted the collective imagination, not because they were forgettable, but because they were unforgettable. Centuries after their deaths, they lived on as symbols of chaos, warnings about the collapse of order, proof that the line between justice and horror was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. Picture yourself hearing one of those tales by firelight. The storyteller leans close, lowering his voice, and when the hood was pulled back, it wasn't a man at all, but a woman. She smiled before the axe fell. A shiver runs through the room. People laugh nervously, but the fear sticks. That's the legacy of the female executioner, half truth, half nightmare, all unforgettable. History has a strange way of remembering the people it doesn't want to remember. Female executioners lived, worked, and shaped the fears of their communities for centuries. Yet when we look into official chronicles, they almost vanish. Their names were scrubbed out, their deeds left unrecorded, their lives reduced to whispers. It wasn't an accident, it was deliberate erasure. Chroniclers, almost always male clerics, were uncomfortable with the very idea. To them, a woman who wielded the axe was a contradiction, a threat to the order God supposedly designed. Easier to leave her unnamed, to bury her existence in silence, better to remember the scaffold as a man's world. And so they did. Scroll after scroll lists the executioner without gender. Centuries later, historians digging into records have stumbled upon the rare moment when a scribe slipped and revealed his widow carried out the sentence. But even as the official record erased them, the memory of women executioners refused to die. Their shadows slipped into folklore, jokes and insults. Ordinary people remembered. They talked about the humiliation of men who fell to their hands. They sang songs mocking the executioner's daughter. They told stories by candlelight of the woman with the bloodied axe, erased in ink, immortalized in whispers. The stigma lingered in families too. Generations later, descendants still carried the mark. Some even changed their names, moved towns, tried to bury the connection. But oral tradition kept the memory alive. Grandparents warning children about that family spoke more truth than dusty records. And then came modern historians, shocked to find traces of these women in dusty archives. They pieced together fragments, marriage contracts, court records, municipal ledgers. The picture that emerged wasn't clean, but it was undeniable. Women had stood on the scaffold. They had executed men. They had been hated, feared, mocked, and then deliberately forgotten. But forgetting had failed. In many ways, the legacy of female executioners isn't just about justice or death. It's about power, gender, and how societies react when the expected order collapses. Their very existence was a scandal to medieval thinking, which is why history tried so hard to erase them. And yet here we are, centuries later, talking about them still. That is their revenge. The silence failed. So next time you think of medieval justice, don't just picture a hooded man with an axe. Picture the woman, standing on the scaffold, the crowd jeering, the condemned trembling, not just from fear of death, but from fear of shame. Picture the generations who tried to bury her story and failed. Because her presence was too disruptive, too unforgettable, too human to vanish. And maybe that's the strangest justice of all.